see where
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for your kind words of introduction, Suraj. It is such a great honor to be here today. And it's also quite intimidating, I have to say, given the level of expertise, knowledge, and wisdom of the other panelists. Tomorrow, the UN is going to launch a one-year-long campaign for the 17th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that 2018 is really a good opportunity for us, activists, scholars, and advocates, to think, to reshape, and somehow to come up with better mechanisms and solutions to make the human rights mechanisms that are now in place much more effective for all of us. In my presentation today, I'll try to tackle two issues. I will start with a brief introduction about the Roma, and I'll try to underline a few parallels with the Dalit communities. And by doing so, and I think I've said that before, I remain mindful about the unique and specific struggles of the Dalit communities. I will then discuss some of the challenges that the Roma movement has had in the past decades in using UN mechanisms and other regional human rights mechanisms in Europe. And I'll focus a little bit on the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So let me start with the Roma. Roma, or the Romani people, is an umbrella term that we use for Roma, Gitanos, Sinti, Manouche, subgroups that you can meet everywhere in Europe and in other regions. Oftentimes, in the European context, much more in the American context, we are pejoratively called gypsies. Roma origins are in India, and I think this is, part of the connection that needs also to be put on the table. And scholars estimate that the migration of the Roma to Europe has happened about 1,000 years ago or so. To date, we have about 14 to 15 million Roma living across the world. The majority of them live in Europe. There are about 12 million Roma living in Central, Eastern Europe, and so on. But there is also quite a large population of Roma in Australia, Latin America, the United States, and there are some Roma-related groups in the Middle East as well. Roma are citizens of the countries they live in, unless some of the institutional barriers hinder that citizenship. Throughout the centuries, there was a persistent powerful to powerless relationship between the non-Roma population and the Roma population. In Europe, for more than 7 centuries, Roma have gone through different forms of exclusion and violence. In Romania, they've been slaves for 500 years. About 1.5 million Roma have been killed during the Holocaust. They've experienced forced assimilation in Central and Eastern Europe until the 90s, and they've also experienced forced sterilization of Romani women till recently in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and there is quite a long history of forced sterilization in Sweden as well. Europeans have never seen us as falling under the umbrella of the European citizen, which you may think that is more an image of a white Christian European. And one of the earlier scholars categorized Roma as a distinct race without religion and perhaps without morals. And also, we have for centuries lived among superior nations. And this idea of gypsy criminality and gypsy inferiority has been embedded in the European cultures for centuries. The misrepresentation of the Roma as a dangerous race have built up a low-ranking gypsy identity. And this is how we are seen today as well. And the more the non-Roma have problematized the Roma and presented them as inferior and dangerous, the more evidently white supremacy and whiteness and what we call Gajoness in our own language has been has gained power and also value. More so, the history and the collective memory of domination and power imposed through these sort of anti-Romani policies, including the slavery and the killings and the forced assimilation, not only that have not received any recognition in the history of Europe, but have also pushed and maintained very real the anti-Romani sentiments up to today. And finally, Roma have been called Athenganos or Athenganoi, which in the Old Greek language means literally untouchable or impure. And up to the present day, the non-Roma continue, in spite of our protests, to call us Tsigan, Tsigonski, Tsigoiner. All of these terms are variation of the untouchable terminology.
Can you repeat what was the term again?
Athenganos. It's in Old Greek. So, in many ways, the basic idea of untouchability is very much familiar to my people and to our community. Also similar to India, the jure abolition of discrimination and the ratification of some UN human rights mechanisms have not led to the dismantle of de facto discrimination, which continues to manifest it really in all aspects of life. In 2016, for instance, in a Pew Research Center survey, 85% of Italians, 66% of French, and 53% of Greeks, they all have had unfavorable opinions about the Roma. And it's not just that they have unfavorable opinions. These opinions do translate into policies and do translate into practices as well. For instance, Romani children are oftentimes segregated in special schools for children with mental disabilities. They are also placed in separated school buildings and in separated classes. And the only argument for that is really their ethnicity. Oftentimes, I think you hear that the Roma or the Gypsies do not value education. And this is something that many Europeans would first say to you when you ask what they think about the Roma. Where in fact, in many countries, children do enroll to school. In Hungary, more than 95% of Romani children enroll to the first grade. What happens is that they get segregated. And it's not just segregation and the act of discrimination, but it's also the fact that the quality of education in these classrooms is very, very poor. They don't get to learn how to read and to write by the end of primary school. And those who actually practice absenteeism are not the kids. These are the teachers. And there is studies showing that that's a phenomenon happening in Roma-only schools and classes. They are also often placed in the back of the classroom, and this happens to other minorities as well. And violence against children, from physical violence to bullying, also occur inside and outside the school environment. We had an incident a few months ago, and I think that spoke to many other incidents in the Dalit communities where a young boy was beaten by a young Roma boy in Bulgaria was beaten up by a Bulgarian because he was asked if he thought that Roma were equal with Bulgarians, and the boy dared to say yes. And that violent incident went to a level that was hard to imagine. Also, entire Roma communities in different European countries are just pushed at the margins. So residential segregation is really a big issue, and is not a choice of the communities. It's just that they are pushed away from the communities. And you may believe it or not, but in Europe there are walls that separate the Roma communities from the non-Roma communities. In Romania, in Slovakia, mayors have built walls just to make sure that the non-Roma do not get to meet with the Roma. And we organize protests against these practices, and we try to challenge in the court, but the walls are still there. Also, speaking of new trends of fascism and neoliberalism and so on, in Europe, I think we really need to look more carefully at how minorities are treated, because in the past decade, a lot of violent attacks, extremist attacks, hate crime, and hate speech have in many ways become the norm in Roma communities. In some countries, extremist groups and paramilitary groups organize military trainings for their members. And in other countries, these groups also get to kill Roma and Roma children and their families. And Hungary has been one of the countries where you would see these incidents happening very often. But I want to stop here because I think, I could go on and on talking about violence against Roma and discrimination. And I think the purpose of this presentation is not necessarily to look at all these types of human rights violations, but rather to see where we connect. And here is where I want to make two parallels. One is really to say that the goal of separation and pushing Dalit families away at the margins has been a tactic used against Roma communities as well for many years. And the use of violence to punish and to control the Dalit communities is also practiced against the Roma communities as well. A few months ago, we've had another panel here talking about similarities between Roma and the Dalits, and I talked more in depth about the similarities, and I don't want to repeat that. But I do hope that you get to read the piece that Suraj and I wrote about these similarities and think a little bit further about that. So the second point is really to build on Paul's recommendations at the end of his presentation, and to think a little bit at the implementation of the UN mechanisms that we actually have in place, and to think how we can improve them. And I'll just give you this example. So while I kind of recognize the importance of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination as a monitoring treaty body, I also acknowledge that it has limited capacity. And we can learn from that limited capacity in thinking over about what we want to do at the level of the UN and how would the next mechanisms look like, right? So, for instance, if you look at the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the committee itself, their urgent action, early warning procedure, and also the individual petition mechanism lack awareness in local communities, and also implementation. Not many of the people in our communities really know about these mechanisms, and neither the local NGOs. Also, during the official sessions, observers, including NGOs, do have the right to be in the room, but they don't have the right to speak up. And I think that's an issue that we need to challenge, and we need to change in the next few years. Also, as the committee uses these shadow reports from the NGOs, very often it's a big struggle for the NGOs themselves to come up with the reports and to go and present the results of these reports in front of the UN. So that's also something that I think it needs to be discussed, and we need to come up with recommendations in order to really make these mechanisms work much better. So I do hope that during the discussion today we debate and we deconstruct the patterns of oppression at global level, and we discuss much more the effectiveness of the UN mechanisms, and come up with ideas on moving forward for the Roma, the Dalits, and other groups that are in similar situations with our communities. And I think that the tactics and the strategies of oppression synchronizes across continents and across countries, and they take the forms of violence and mass incarceration and structural discrimination, segregation, lack of access to education, and lack of access to health. But then how could the oppressed move forward without changing the minds and the behavior of the oppressed? Is this a matter of integration and inclusion, or this is more a matter of emancipating the dominant populations, starting from the schools and the citizens and continuing with the state institutions? And I think that part of the more theoretical challenge of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, but also of other UN mechanisms, is how to shift the focus from the minority as a problem to the majority as the target. And finally, just to build on more on your points, Paul, I think it's also relevant for us to think how we imagine these UN mechanisms, but not only, also some other regional mechanisms, in a way that we create solidarity. Because I think that is not an innocent decision for many to just keep us separated and let us work in isolation. So I think this is really a hope that I have for the next year, that we work together and we try to create more solidarity between our groups. And I'll stop here because it's always a challenge to talk about Roma issues in an American audience. I never know exactly who knows what, and I just don't like to repeat myself. But I'm open to any kind of questions, and yeah, please feel free to ask sensitive questions. I always like them.
So, well, thank you, Magda. Let's open the floor. Before we do that, we're waiting on the food, so if we have just a few questions, we might be able to move to Abda's talk, finish all the speakers and discussion, get the food, come back and do the plenary with everybody. So why don't we just see if we have a couple of questions first. Yes, please, Joel.
Thank you so much. And this may be something you presented in your other ones, but I wasn't here. On the question of work and occupational niches, I read something on sort of sanitation labor in Romania being upward of 90% Roma. Could you sort of just paint a bit of a picture of the kind of occupational side of the Roma situation in Europe?
So Well, let me put it this way. Only 1% Roma in Europe make it to college. About 10% of them somehow succeed to get to high school. And there are a lot of structural problems why this happens. Segregation is really one of the factors. Discrimination is also a factor that pushes them out of school in many ways and creates a lot of trauma, speaking of your work. So that creates somehow disadvantage when it comes to workforce anyhow, because I think that in an European Union, for instance, that advances much more towards tech skills and educated people with college and so on. Roma are not competitive on the market, on the markets where they would want to be. And on top of that, regardless of your education, if an employer knows that you are Roma, you don't get a chance to get a job. And I've experienced that. I know some of the most educated Roma in Romania have tried to get jobs, and it's complicated. Unless they work in an NGO, they don't get a good job. So that's also part of the picture. We've been slaves for 500 years in Romania, and that really contributed also a lot to the way that the Gaje, the non-Roma, see us, but also in the way that ourselves perceive what we can do. So many of our people work for the Gaje, for the non-Roma, and that's the normal. They would, work on their lands. This is what we've done in the slavery period as well. They would clean their houses. They would do the dirty jobs. If you go to a mall in Bucharest, you will see that those who clean everything are Roma. If you go to any place where there is a low-paid job, those are of the Roma. And even those jobs are hard to get because the gypsy criminality is still there and people are afraid that we are going to steal something. So to make it simple, job and labor market is really a problem for the Roma, given that in the past we had our own crafts that are not anymore on the market now, and also given the level of discrimination and lack of education and all that puzzle make it very difficult for the Roma to get good jobs.
Yes, Iman.
Thanks so much, Magda. So I really appreciated what you were saying about how to really shift the focus from the minority, pathologize as this problem, to the majority and starting to think about that. And I guess I'm just curious. I've worked for just a few years, in Roma communities, and I find that anytime that I bring that work up or talk to anyone in American context about that, it's just so heavily saturated with this mythology and romanticism, these ideas, right, about Roma. And I often feel like I'm at a loss to kind of expand the conversation to actually like the real human rights issues that are occurring. That it's kind of like this cultural idea that we feel like people feel like they know like what the issues are for Roma. And so I'm wondering, just in terms of activism, like what's your strategy for speaking to, speaking to people? Do you feel that even that's an important avenue, to help normal, average people that maybe don't know anything about these issues? Is that even important? Or kind of what's your strategy for overcoming like that romanticism?
So there is a whole Roma movement in Europe working on that topic, and they are trying to dismantle the anti-Romani sentiments and also these ideas of the exotic Roma, the other Roma, and so on. But in the US, it's less work conducting on that because there are only a few activists and scholars working on this topic. And therefore, we all try to put a lot of efforts into going to events, responding to all media requests, writing as much as we can in order to raise awareness. It's not easy for us to keep up with everything because once in a while you'll see a TV show on an American station about the gypsy criminality or the gypsy sisters or gypsies here and gypsies there. And the reactions are there, right? We try to write petitions, to criticize, but it's when you criticize and bring a race question in relation to Roma is not the same as you would have raised the same question for any other group, because you don't have the social power. You don't have the power to say, well, this is wrong and this is racism. Everyone finds it a little bit acceptable to think about the Roma as criminals and so on. But I found also a lot of interesting people who wanted to learn about all these, derogatory words and also negative perceptions. When I tell people that to be gypsy in English comes from the gypsy criminality, they apologize, and they feel bad. And that's just because there is not awareness about that. At Harvard, what I'm trying to do, and I've done that for 5 years, is really to involve the student body into discussions on Roma. And I go to events, they talk about food, I talk about Roma, I'll find a way to ask a question and to bring that issue up every time I'm in the room. So I raise awareness because many of the students, at least at the Kennedy School, are not just students at the Kennedy School. They are also future policymakers, many of them in Europe. And I do want them to understand that there is bias. Mm-hmm. It's a long process, but I think that all of us are trying to bring a small contribution, and I think that your contribution and also others at Brandeis and any other universities in the US can really make a change, because we need to raise awareness about this topic. And I'm really grateful for your work for us.
Can we take one more question? I'll do some concluding reflections on this talk as we transition to Abna. So just one brief question.
Thank you. I think it was a fascinating talk. So I'm just curious to know how different political regimes and political systems have addressed this question, and what have been their shifting rationalities and ethical protocols. So there must be some sort of shifts, across the time span. So I'm just curious about that.
Most of the Roma populations are gathered in Central and Eastern Europe. And that part of Europe has also been, for quite a while, under a communist regime or under communist regimes. And that shifted a lot, I think, the Roma identity in many ways. It shaped it in all the possible ways, because on one hand, discrimination was forbidden in these countries. You are not allowed to call anyone a Roma or Hungarian if they are, minority in a country and so on. But on the other hand, we've been stripped of our language, culture, and crafts. So, for instance, I don't speak Romani, and I always feel that that's a loss for my own personal identity. I feel that my Roma identity is much more political than actual. So, there is a loss there that I think that many of us miss. And the shift from communism to democracy in Central and Eastern Europe was not easy. We were amazed when Havel came and said that, the test for our democracies is really the treatment of the Roma. And we thought that will change dramatically the situation of the Roma. It has not so far, because the end of the communism really brought a lot of frustration out. In Romania, at the beginning of the 90s, we had more than 40 what the Romanians call interethnic conflicts, but they were more pogroms because the Roma were not violent, were just the non-Roma putting their houses on fire and expelling them from the communities and killing them. And that's how the frustration came up. But there is a positive note because the transition to democracy also made a change from having in the beginning of 90s no Roma awareness in policies and laws and also at the level of implementation to now when 27 years later in every European country and even at the level of the European Union you have policies that are designed for the Roma and they mention the Roma and the laws are a little bit more sensitive about the Roma. Does it really work in reality? It doesn't because the communities continue to be as poor as they were in the 90s. And I think the change can be seen mostly in activism and at the elites level, but not so much in our communities. And there are different political regimes, like Eastern Europe, in most countries, they recognize the rights of the minorities. There is a lot of work on cultural rights, language, and so on. Whereas in France, for instance, where Roma, along with many other minorities, are not recognized because this is how the Constitution of France works. That's a very different environment too, because on one hand there is no recognition of these minorities, and everyone is equal and French. But on the other hand, if you look at the policies that the government, regardless of who is in charge in the government of France, if you look at their policies, they do target the Roma. They issued a proposal, a law proposal, I think back in 2008, where they wanted to fingerprint those who were traveling inside and outside France. And that was because the Roma were very visible in France. So, on one hand, there is an idea of everyone is equal, but on the other hand, they do target minorities when they want to. And overall, I think I have a background in activism. I'm more careful when I write, but when I speak, I do say these things very clearly. It doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work with the Roma in Europe is racism. There is nothing else. It's discrimination against them, and it's the biases that the policy makers do have against them.
So thank you, Magda, for this wonderful talk. Magda's courage and conviction. And the concluding reflection here as we transition to our next speaker is, I really applaud the work that Magda's doing at Suraj. I'd love to see this be shared with the community. And this is my question for you as we think about the plenary and the entire group. If you take the Black experience, and then you take the caste experience, and you take those two lenses to shine it on the uniqueness of the Roma oppression, why do the categories here in these two dimensions collapse when we're trying to capture this complexity? Not just because of the lack of social power. So let's just try to lay out some of the dialectical contradictions. In the Black experience, there's an expropriation from a different geography, the continent of Africa, ensconced into a system of slavery 500 years ago, which then leads to modalities of oppression that change over time. Segregation through the civil rights, and now it's built into our state system. State violence against blacks, the school to prison pipeline, deterioration of the public sector in the inner cities. But the black-white, white and then black and other racialized minorities, that's a dialectical structure that we don't find in caste per se, although as I mentioned in my earlier comment, we do. But why does the Roma picture complicate even that structure? Because the inverse is that there's the assertion of black power. There is the assertion of the visibility of the social movement, like Black Lives Matter today, civil rights in the past. There is the rise of people to power in certain positions. There's a collectivity that goes back to Du Bois in terms of associations like the NAACP. For the caste system, there's an indigenous structure whose origins are unknown, born from one religion, not any other religion. It continues in a certain geographic context and spreads through the global diaspora. There's caste discrimination in the United States. But here you have, irrespective of the question of color and the assertion of power, also an attempt to assert identity, also an attempt to capture through reservations in both employment, only the public sector, as Dr. Paul said, and schools. And there's the possibility with the legacy of Ambedkar to take on socialism, Buddhism, and perhaps a new model of the socioeconomy that would completely dismantle the democratic structure that India inherited because of Gandhi. Not because of the architecture of Ambedkar, but because of the democracy that was formed that continues to oppress other peoples. African Americans speak about the utter disaster of democracy today. Dalits and untouchable and low caste speak of the democratic system of India continuing to act with impunity on the greatest atrocities. But why do both of these systems fail in their limitations to understand Roma? Roma is a displacement. Roma is the invisibilization within the most white supremacist, if you will, context based on the figures you showed us. The historical conflation you had to suffer under the oppression of other peoples within the European context in the 20th century, through the Holocaust. Your suffering took place through the targeted oppression of another group. And then lastly, the lack of social assertion and power, not just because maybe the size of the population dispersed over 700 million people in the EU, but really you take almost the worst dimensions of black oppression and Dalit oppression and telescope it into the structure of Roma within the European context where the majority is. It's almost like a living continuity of all those other systems for those other two groups. And in conclusion, one last point. Foucault speaks about governmentality. That means when the state, under the name of law, justice, policy, organization, order, protection against external enemies, just war, constantly has to experiment on a group of people, has to invent ways to perfect the minutiae of the way violence takes place against a people who is primordially designated as other, is completely marginalized. The people without morals, the people without citizenship, the people without religion, the people without identity. A Foucaultian analysis would say this is exactly the kind of group that states continue to experiment on. And because it becomes so transient, the global scale can't recognize it, national economies can't recognize it, it almost capsizes the possibility to create an indigenous or minority assertion of self-power, which you do have with Black Power and Dalit movements. So here's a group that also suffers under the experimentation of the state to pathologize, criminalize, and silence. So I want to leave us with that. I mean, we're now moving to three different areas of the comparison of oppression: Black, Dalit, and now the world. So with that, we're going to move to our final speaker. We'll go for a good 30 minutes. The presentation is about 20 or 30 minutes. 20 minutes or so. We'll do 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. We'll break, get the food, and then finish with our plenary with all three speakers. So, please welcome. I want to introduce. Abdarahman is what I'd rather say in the true extent of his name, but he says, please call him as Abda, and I will bring up his slide. Let's make it so complicated. View slideshow.
Down here.
Down to the left. Down to the left. Let's do it. This one doesn't have that. This one?
Some more. No. Next. No, next.
Oh, there we go. This one is. Yes.
Well, I was saying to myself, it's going to be very hard to speak after my little sister Magda and my mentor Paul and my younger brother Suraj make it very difficult when he presented our brother Sampath as the follower of Jacques Derrida. For us who work for Codestria, I mean the philosophical background of our ideas based on the deconstructions. And so we have to read Jacques Derrida, and knowing he has one of his students here makes things a lot even more difficult. However, I will try to just to talk a little bit about slavery and racism in Africa in general. I will focus on Mauritania to explain more and tell you what have been done so far. And the title of my presentation is very simple. It's Dalits and Haratins are human. I could also have add, say, Dalits, Haratins, and Roma are human beings. Why? Because there are, even though in the university level, we all agree they are all human beings. But in the reality, that is not the case. Mostly if you are coming from countries such as Mauritania, and not only Mauritania, but when you are coming from Africa. And I will move to the context. Today the context is a little bit crucial because of what happened in Libya. Since 2015, hundreds of thousands of refugees and migrants have crossed the Mediterranean into Europe from Africa and the Middle East. Known as the gateway of Europe, Libya has seen many people pass through its border as part of their journey. Unfortunately, traffickers are exploiting the complete lack of governance in the country of migrant and refugees' desperation. Slave markets are flourishing around Libya. And when I say slave market, it's true, it's like auctions. And my brothers and sisters who are coming from basically the western countries of Africa are stuck in Libya and are being auctioned and sold. And of course, the selling of slaves go often with human rights violations. And the images that you see are real. We get to see it, and we were in that part of the world to see how our brothers and sisters who just wanted to go to Europe to find a better life ended up being in Libya and being sold as slaves, as it used to happen in the past. So for us, the past is the present, and the present is the past. Well, this is not fake images. These images are realities of my brothers and sisters who were basically just trying to make a better life. On their way to Europe, they ended up basically in Libya. And as you can see, Libya is becoming a place where human beings are suffering. Now, for us, this is not news. This is our everyday life. And there are communities in Africa who've been experiencing this kind of situation for centuries. And it happened in the country of my birth, I mean Mauritania. Mauritania is, of course, located in West Africa, West North, and it's in between the northern part of Africa and the western part of Africa. And it's a meeting point where you have two groups of people. You have Arabs who live in the northern part and Africans who live in the southern part of Africa. And the interaction of these two people have created a huge population of what is called Haratins or slaves. Haratin, also referred to us as Haratin, it depends on our Hartani, was this dweller in the Sahara, especially in the Maghreb. They are particularly found in Mauritania, Morocco, and of course in the Western Sahara. Today, in 2017, almost in 2018, there are people, as like I used to say, who belong to other people, and it happened in Mauritania. And the world know about it, but nobody cares. So we have our Dalits people. The thing is, slavery was outlawed or abolished 4 times. Why 4 times? Why even 2 times? If it's if the abolition is effective, it shouldn't have like another type of abolition. That means culturally, people are not willing really to leave the Haratani away, to let them go and to free them. And as Paul said in his presentation, Hartani are blacks. So the domination is not on just the base of their color, because you have other groups who are Fulani, who are Soninke, who are Bambar, who are not treated as slaves because they didn't inherit it. They were not inherited like were the Haratin. So you have a huge group, almost 34 to 40% of Mauritanians who are descendants of slaves and who belong to other people as we are speaking. Mauritania is not just dealing with slavery, we are dealing with racism. So Africans who are Fulanis, Wolof, Soninke, and Bambara, who live in the southern part of Mauritania, are also treated as a second-class citizen in their own country. To illustrate what I'm saying, I will give you just 3 examples. The first one was in 1986, a group of intellectuals, activists, because to us it's very clear, an intellectual is the one who really wants to change the future of his fellow citizen. Otherwise, you are just a scholar, not an intellectual. So, sorry. Concept here.
No problem at all.
This concept here is very. So that's you have racism and who are done. Racism is done against Fulanis, Soninke, Wolof, and even Bambara who live in the southern part of the country. So in 1986, a group of Mauritanians who belong to the African Liberation Forces tried to say this is not right. It's good for us to come together as a country and see what should be done so we can build a more democratic country. And the response of the government was, wow, blacks are trying now to be awake and to claim for their right in this country. So let's finish them, let's kill them. So they decide just to arrest more than 84 intellectuals, put them in jail, and like some of them died in jail. And actually, their manifesto was just a call for a discussion. And then a call for a discussion lead to 4 to 5 years in jail. That can tell you the kind of regimes that we have in Mauritania. That will happen in 1986. In 1987, the same thing happened with the military. And in 1989, they decided to deport, just to expel 200,000 blacks. So they can, the idea behind the deportation of blacks were, if you look at Mauritania, the only fertile land is located in the south. The north is deserted. You cannot practice agriculture over there. So to have fewer blacks and to keep exploiting the fertile land, they decide to deport blacks who are living from the south to Senegal and to Mauritania. More than 200,000 were deported. I was one of them. I was 16 in 1989 when my family was deported among those 200,000 to Senegal. And the reason of their deportation was just to forget about Mauritania, to go and live in Senegal and in Mali, and not to talk about the issue. So luckily enough, that may answer the question of my little sister Magda. We had the first generation of freedom fighters met, and they said this struggle is not a struggle of a generation. So let's prepare the future. Let's prepare the youth so they will take over and continue the struggle. That's what happened, and we are trying to continue the struggle. And I'm pleased to introduce you one of my fellow Mauritanians who I met here today, Khalidou, who I know through Facebook, and we just met, and he is one of those who want to continue the struggle because we cannot win that battle if we don't send our kids to universities. And once they are in the universities, they should also go back to the villages and know they belong. The concept of elite is a concept that will alienate Africans. So just go away, let us move away from that concept and know we belong to the people and we don't belong to the elite. The concept of elite was created just to put us aside from our people. And I'm glad we are starting working on this. So, what is the response to slavery in Africa? We know we live in a village, in a global village, and we know what happened to Mauritanians shouldn't be left to Mauritanians alone. And we know in this world there are people like black Mauritanians or like let's say slave in Nigeria and Niger, who people like this can be found in Asia, in Europe. So we decide to go and discuss with them and know when they were suffering, what did they do to, or what are they doing to put an end to their suffering. And that's how we met with great people like Paul. Paul was being a friend of Mauritanians since basically 2000 when they were preparing the conference that took place in Durban. So Africans are no longer alone. Dalits in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka are experiencing the same situation. And we are pleased to know our brothers and sisters Roma are coming together to build an alliance and to work together. And we, at the same time, this is not something that we are just leaving to Paul or to Magda, but this is everybody's struggle. Not only people who are coming from those communities, because at the end of the day, someone can be outside these communities and be aware of this is unjust, this is not right, and something needs to be done. And this person or those people are welcome to the fight. So since July, we've been working to have a common agenda so we can work together. And we met during that high-level political conference, and we decided to do something. And since then, I've been working with some Pan-African organization, Human Rights Coalition, to do things together. And today, it's very easy because of the context of Libya. Everybody is coming together, and we think something has to be done, and we need to let the world know this is not something that should happen, and this struggle will not be pushed to the incoming generation. We have to fight it, and we shouldn't just dump it to the coming generation. We have to do something. And the milestone is everybody in Africa is basically ready. I had a couple of discussions with my fellow human rights activists, and we are ready. We are already organizing rallies in South African capitals such as Dakar and Cote d'Ivoire and now many organizations are involved in that matter. So Africa, I would say Africa or some part of some African organizations are ready for the global movement. And I don't know if you are ready, but we are. I'm sure you are. We will go for that global movement so we can bring the issue to the UN. I know the issue is already before the UN, but they need to know this is no longer a Dalit business, but this is everybody's business. And for us, it's not just condemning, but it's also making sure the UN should sanction countries that are still violating these basic human rights. This is, I said conclusions, but this is basically one conclusion. Descent-based discriminated communities should come together to let the world know we are all human beings. And it's a human rights issue. It's no longer just us as communities who are discriminated against, but it's everybody's business. Since I came here, people were just making me feel very good and feel Dalit. So thanks to Boston Study Group for organizing this event, and thanks to the Asian Dalit Rights Forum and Paul who is here, and thanks to Sanjay who for the bad and the best Indian food ever. And thank you, Professor, for everything, and thanks to my younger brother who made the presentation and who is now well known in some Francophone African countries because of a small video that we made, and that is basically talking about how Dalits and Africans should come together to work together. So thank you, everybody.
So now, before we prepare for the food, maybe a couple of questions from the audience. Porter, yes.
Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. I'm interested to know a little bit about the slavery and how does that exist, and what are the ways that you are just applying this to reduce that sort of the slavery. And actually, same questions I would like to put the Roma community. Later on, we'll discuss in a plenary. And could you tell a little bit about the slavery, how that has been institutionalized, and what are the ways that you are adopting this to reduce that way of practicing in your context?
Great question.
That's a very great and difficult question. But slavery is not just existing in Mauritania. Like it's happened to, we listed 14 countries, even though our study will focus on 7 countries. And Mauritania, Sudan is basically getting out of those countries, but slavery exists like the way that it used to exist in this country. So you have people who were captured during some razzias organized by Arabs, and once they are enslaved, they have, they have to speak the language of their master. So when you go back to Mauritania, for instance, slaves speak Arabic, the language of people who enslaved them. And it happens that population grow up very fast, quickly, and ended up becoming the most important population, or group of population in Mauritania, for instance. Now, why people don't know about it is basically, that's what I usually say. It's when indigenous people are exploiting or discriminating all the indigenous people, it seems like the West doesn't care. That's my opinion. Because it's indigenous, so it's not done in their name. For them to do something, in South Africa, they did something to stop it because it was done in the name of Westerner. And so to stop it, they did something. Now, in countries such as Zaire, when people are killing each other, or in countries such as Rwanda, they don't do anything because it's just indigenous killing all the indigenous. That's one of the reasons why the issue was not as known as it should. The second reason is France has done a lot, not only, to minimize the effect. We live in, we are in America today. I belong to the first generation of Mauritanians who came to the US, who learned how to speak English and try to to bring the issue before the Americans. So you have the language barrier, and you have the fact that France never wanted really this kind of issues to be known. And that's the second reason. The third reason is basically what is lacking, or what was lacking in this kind of organizations, is everybody is trying to do something internally. The Dalit in India were trying just to fight for themselves without working with the Dalits in Sri Lanka, for instance. Now we know we have all to come together. It brings the issue easier to address worldwide and internationally. So I think that was what was lacking. And also the other reason is basically Mauritania used to be a country that is poor. When you don't have oil, you don't have gold, you don't have mining, no one cares what is the situation. They only care when they have like financial or interest.
Thank you, Abdul. Yes, our gentleman, a colleague from Mauritania.
Thank you. I'm really happy that I got to be here by coincidence in joining you today. So, IRA or ERA, they have been doing a great work, like in kind of globalizing and raising awareness about the issue of slavery in Mauritania. But people have like been criticizing them in a way that, for example, just like most of the movements, like it just focuses on like leaders and gaining fame and everything. But what they have been doing has not been really concrete in changing of the lives of the people who are allegedly like slaves or have been descendants of the slave. You as someone like who's been in touch and working with IRA, do you think do you think or have you discussed with them strategies on how to make a touch on changing the lives of the people who are considered slaves in Mauritania, especially of course